He is the man the world calls America's dad. The warm smile, the calm voice, the rare kind of actor who could make millions believe that decency still mattered. We saw him as Forrest Gump, a soul too pure for the cruelty around him. We watched him survive the isolation of Castaway, fight for dignity in Philadelphia, and lead soldiers through the chaos of Saving Private Ryan. To us, Tom Hanks became the heartbeat of Hollywood, a living reminder that kindness could survive in an industry built on vanity. But behind the red carpets and ovations hides a truth that is almost unbearable. Because the man who taught us to believe in hope has carried a life story filled with loneliness, heartbreak, devastating illness, and the kind of family pain no trophy can mend. At 69, Tom Hanks is still fighting battles the public will never see. Battles that began in a broken childhood, followed him into the loneliness of fame, and returned in the illnesses that threatened both his life and the woman he loves most. This is the tragedy of Tom Hanks. And once you hear it, you will never look at him the same way again. Tom Hanks was born on July 9, 1956, in Concord, California. To the world, it may sound like a typical beginning. But for young Tom, the very foundation of family collapsed before he could even understand what the word meant. When Tom was just 4 years old, his parents' marriage ended. There were no loud fights to remember, no dramatic courtroom battles. Instead, there was something colder: silence. A silence that carved the family in two. Tom and two of his siblings were placed in the care of their father, Amos. His youngest brother stayed with their mother, Janet. And from that moment on, the Hanks children lived like passengers on a train that never stopped. His father was a cook, always moving from job to job. With each new kitchen came a new address. By the time Tom was 10, he had already lived in 10 different homes. 10 strange bedrooms with peeling paint, borrowed beds, and the faint smell of someone else's life still clinging to the walls. There was never enough money. Meals were simple enough to keep the body alive, but never enough to feed the heart. And every time Tom began to settle into a new school, he was uprooted again, forced to start over as the outsider, the kid who didn't belong. He wore clothes until they frayed. He learned to stay quiet, to stay out of the way.
I was a geek, an outsider, he would later admit.
But behind those words was a darker truth. Tom had already learned something children should never have to learn: that asking for love or stability only leads to disappointment. His home was not a house. It was a suitcase. And yet, in this gray, unsettled childhood, there was one place where Tom felt seen: the stage. In dusty school auditoriums, under buzzing lights, Tom could escape. He could step into another life, where people listened, where applause broke the silence that haunted him. That applause was not just noise. To Tom, it was oxygen. But the curtain always fell, the lights always dimmed. And each night he went back to another temporary bed, another strange wall, another reminder that he was still alone. Looking back, Tom described his childhood in one word: lonely. From a man who would one day embody kindness on screen, that word feels unbearable. But it was in those endless lonely nights that Tom made a silent promise to himself. If he ever found his voice, he would use it to make others feel seen, to shield them from the same ache of invisibility that had shaped him. It was this vow, born in poverty and solitude, that would carry him through every role, every act of kindness, and every struggle to rise above the shadows that never truly let go. Adulthood didn't arrive as a rescue for Tom. It came dressed as another kind of loneliness. In 1977, at just 21 years old, Tom boarded a bus to New York City. He carried a battered suitcase, an old typewriter, and a fragile hope that somewhere in the chaos, he might be noticed. He had dropped out of Sacramento State University, where he'd studied theater but never quite found his footing. He believed New York would be different. On postcards, the city looked like magic, skyscrapers glowing, Broadway lights promising stardom. But up close, it was brutally indifferent. The rooms he could afford were tiny, often shared with strangers. Some nights he slept on floors. Other nights he found a couch if he was lucky. His pockets were almost always empty. Meals came from whatever coins he could scrape together, and when winter pressed in, the nights were colder than he had ever imagined. Casting calls were his only lifeline. He stood in long lines, clutching his headshot, praying someone would see him as more than a skinny kid with a funny voice. But most auditions ended the same way, with silence. Years later, he recalled leaving rooms convinced the casting directors didn't see a leading man at all. "I learned early on that the room didn't need me," he admitted. And that's a hard thing to carry home at night. But Tom didn't break. The rejection carved him into something else, relentless. He took every opportunity, no matter how small or humiliating. Bit parts in off-Broadway plays, low-budget horror films, like He Knows You're Alone, 1980, which paid just enough to cover rent. Stagehand work at the Great Lakes Theater Festival in Cleveland, where he acted by day and built sets, hung lights and swept the stage by night. He called those years his true education. "Those years taught me everything," he reflected. "You show up, you work, and you keep going, even if no one notices." And finally, at 24, a crack in the wall appeared. In 1980, he landed a role in the quirky sitcom Bosom Buddies. It was absurd. He dressed in women's clothes just so his character could rent an apartment. The show only lasted 2 seasons, but for Tom it was proof that maybe, just maybe, he could survive in this unforgiving business. Yet, even then, the fear never left. Every time a job ended, he worried the dream would vanish, and he'd be back on a bus, suitcase in hand, returning to invisibility. Looking back, he admitted something powerful. "I didn't have a plan B. I just knew I couldn't go back to feeling invisible." That invisible boy, the one who lived in 10 houses by the age of 10, was still inside him, pushing him to stay on stage a little longer. Applause, even from a small crowd, meant he was worth keeping around this time. What looked like destiny to us, the rise of Tom Hanks was in reality a daily act of survival. And it was survival that shaped the man the world would one day call the kindest soul in Hollywood. From sitcoms to silver screens, Tom Hanks's rise looked effortless to the world watching from the seats. But behind the camera, each triumph asked for something deeper than applause. His transition from lighthearted comedies like Big to landmark dramas like Philadelphia marked a turning point, not just in his career but in his life. Every role demanded more of him. Every character carved another piece from his heart. For Philadelphia, 1993, Tom lost nearly 35 pounds to embody a man dying from AIDS. The transformation was physical, but the weight seemed to strip away something from his spirit too. He carried the stigma, the pain, even after the cameras stopped rolling. Then came Forrest Gump, 1994. The role brought him a wave of love worldwide. But behind the smiles was a daring gamble. Instead of accepting a fixed $7 million salary, he chose to take a share of the film's profits. The decision made him more than $70 million, but it also transformed applause into pressure. Success was no longer a reward. It was a test he had to keep passing. In Saving Private Ryan, 1998, he shouldered the trauma of war. Not in explosions or grand gestures, but in restrained grief. The role demanded a kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but moral. It was the kind of tiredness that teaches humility rather than pride. And then, Castaway, 2000. To show the passage of years on an island, the production actually shut down for months. During that time, Tom dropped more than 50 pounds. He grew out his beard, lived almost in solitude, and returned to finish the film as a shell of the man who had started it. That loneliness lingered long after filming ended, because playing isolation on screen leaves echoes when the cameras turn off. Audiences saw triumph. Tom lived the toll. Even at the height of fame, he admitted he sometimes felt trapped, as if standing in a beautiful room with the door softly locked. He was admired, adored, respected, yet in the quiet he wondered who he was when the lights went out. There were nights when he left film sets, when the clapping had stopped, and he walked into a trailer where no one was waiting. nights when success felt like another kind of isolation. Despite the Oscars and box office glory, Tom held himself to a merciless standard. He confessed that only a handful of his films ever felt complete in his own eyes. That humility cut deep, but it also kept him grounded. For him, the work wasn't about vanity. It was about service, about telling stories so someone out there might feel less alone. But carrying that responsibility was never easy. Behind the warm face of America's dad was a man who still carried the ache of the invisible boy he once was. And it wasn't just Hollywood that tested him. Because away from the spotlight, his personal life was about to fracture in ways that no award could ever fix. The world often forgets that behind Hollywood smiles are fragile beginnings. For Tom Hanks, the story of love began not with readiness, but with loneliness. At just 21, still struggling to find his footing, Tom married actress Samantha Lewis. To the outside, it looked like the start of a promising family life. But inside it was something more desperate. A young man terrified of repeating the brokenness of his own childhood, clinging to marriage as a lifeline. Within a few short years, Tom and Samantha became parents to 2 children, Colin and Elizabeth. Suddenly, Tom wasn't just an aspiring actor. He was a father, a husband, a provider. But deep down, he knew he was unprepared. He carried a gnawing fear that love alone would not be enough to hold everything together. The marriage quickly showed its cracks. Acting jobs pulled him away, while Samantha struggled under the weight of raising children with little stability. Tom loved his children fiercely, but the demands of Hollywood and the immaturity of youth were stronger than good intentions. By 1987, the marriage ended in divorce. To the public, it was just another Hollywood split. But to Tom, it was a wound that never fully healed. He had promised himself as a boy that the cycle of fractured families would end with him. Yet here he was, watching his children live between 2 households, just as he had. The irony was bitter. The actor who would later be celebrated as the perfect on-screen father felt like a failure in real life. Tom would later admit that he mistook fear for readiness and loneliness for love. That his first marriage wasn't built on solid ground, but on the fragile hope that someone could fill the emptiness inside him. And though the love ended, the bond was never fully broken. Years later, when Samantha was diagnosed with bone cancer, Tom was there. He covered her medical expenses, visited her often, and sat by her bedside, holding the hand of the woman he had once promised forever to. He could not undo the pain. He could not repair what had broken, but he could show up. And that is what he did, until the very end. To the outside world, this was barely a headline. But for Tom, it was another scar etched into his heart, a quiet failure he would carry. Even as the world celebrated him as Hollywood's most dependable man, just when Tom thought love had left him behind, he met Rita Wilson. They crossed paths on set, first as colleagues, then as friends. But what grew between them was something Tom had never truly known before: patience. Rita was different. With her, love didn't feel like a desperate attempt to avoid loneliness. It felt steady, natural, grounded. They fell in love slowly, carefully, as if both knew that what they were building was meant to last. In 1988, just a year after his divorce, Tom and Rita married. Their bond became one of Hollywood's rarest treasures, a marriage that endured, not in spite of challenges, but because of them. For decades, they stood side by side at premieres, raised children together, and created a home that seemed untouched by the chaos of fame. But even the strongest bonds can be tested, and theirs was tested in the harshest of ways. In 2015, Rita was diagnosed with breast cancer. The ground beneath Tom collapsed. The woman who had become his anchor, his safe harbor, now faced a fight for her life. She underwent a double mastectomy, followed by reconstructive surgery. Tom could not shield her from the pain. He could not act his way out of this role. All he could do was hold her hand, sit beside her, and pray. In interviews, he spoke of her strength with awe. He admitted that she had saved his life in ways too numerous to count, and now it was his turn to save hers, If only by never leaving her side. They won that battle. Rita survived, but scars remained on her body and on their hearts. Once you face the possibility of losing the person who completes you, life is never quite the same again. Every quiet moment carries a shadow. Every laugh is tinged with gratitude. Then, 5 years later, the world itself changed. In early 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread, Tom and Rita were among the first public figures to announce they had tested positive while in Australia. For the world, it was shocking news. If even Tom Hanks wasn't safe, who was? For Tom and Rita, it was something much more terrifying. Tom was already living with type 2 diabetes, diagnosed in 2013. The virus wasn't just a scare, it was a potential death sentence. Rita's symptoms were severe. She lost her sense of taste and smell, battled exhaustion, and endured fevers that refused to break. Tom, at 63, felt his body weaken in ways he had never experienced before. He later admitted that during those long nights in isolation, he quietly drafted farewell letters, just in case the world lost him, before he could say goodbye properly. Once again, Tom found himself in the role of caretaker, holding Rita steady while fighting his own fear. And when they recovered, it was not triumph they felt, but humility, because survival had come at a cost. His body was slower now. Walks left him winded. His joints ached. The charm remained, but underneath was a man who wondered how much time he had left. And yet, through breast cancer, through COVID, through diabetes, one thing never broke: their bond. Rita and Tom stood together, weathering storms that would have shattered most couples. Their love was never about perfection. It was about resilience. To the public, Tom Hanks is the symbol of dignity, kindness, and stability. But even the kindest fathers can't always shield their children from life's cruelties. His son Colin followed in his footsteps, building a steady acting career. His daughter Elizabeth chose privacy, living outside the glare of the spotlight. But his son Chet, his story was different. Chet struggled with addiction, erratic behavior, and public controversy. For years, headlines linked his name with lawsuits, outbursts, and accusations. In 2015, after a car accident involving a vehicle registered to Tom and Rita, reports surfaced that Chet had begged the other driver not to call the police. Suspicion of impairment followed, dragging Tom and Rita into legal turmoil they had not caused. For Tom, the pain was unbearable. He had spent his life trying to give his children the stability he never had. And now, he watched history repeat itself in the most heartbreaking way. Chet later admitted he felt like the black sheep of the family, a label Tom never used, but perhaps secretly feared. Friends of the actor say he wrestled with guilt, wondering if his fame, his absences, or the pressure of his legacy had crushed his son. The father who was loved worldwide as America's dad often sat in silence, asking himself why his real son felt so lost. Yet Tom never turned away. He supported Chet through rehab. He endured the headlines with quiet dignity. He stood by his son even when it hurt. Because love, Tom believed, isn't about ease. It's about staying, even when staying is the hardest choice of all. Time does not stop, not even for Hollywood legends. For Tom Hanks, age brought its own quiet battles. In 2013, he revealed he had type 2 diabetes. The diagnosis shocked fans, but Tom had been living with the warning signs for years. Rapid weight changes for films like Philadelphia and Castaway had taken their toll on his body. Managing the disease meant constant monitoring, blood sugar checks, careful eating, exercise routines, medication. For the public, Tom still appeared strong and charming, but privately he lived with needles, fatigue, and the fear that one slip could undo everything. COVID only deepened those struggles. Recovery was slow. Stamina never returned to what it once was. Joints ached. Energy came in shorter bursts. At 69, Tom Hanks is one of the wealthiest actors in Hollywood, with a net worth of nearly $400 million. He lives in a serene villa in Pacific Palisades, with summers spent at a retreat in Greece. Outwardly, his life is one of comfort and peace. But inside he carries battles that money cannot fix. Illnesses that linger, guilt that never fully fades, and the creeping awareness that time itself is the one enemy he cannot defeat. In the end, Tom Hanks's story is not just one of fame, fortune, and unforgettable roles. It is a story of survival. He has endured a childhood of loneliness, a broken first marriage, the heartbreak of watching his son struggle, the fear of losing his wife, the quiet grind of diabetes, and the brush with death during a global pandemic. And yet, he remains. What endures most about Tom Hanks is not the trophies on his shelf, but the kindness he has shown to strangers, to colleagues, to his family, and to millions who have never met him but feel they know him. His legacy is not perfection, but persistence. Not flawless happiness, but scars carried with grace. He proves that true greatness is not measured by applause, but by how much love you can give when the cameras are off. At 69, Tom Hanks is still here, still loving, still fighting, still reminding us that gentleness is not weakness, but strength of the highest order. And perhaps that is his real triumph. Not the films, not the fame, but the quiet courage of a man who endured heartbreak, illness, and loss, and chose kindness anyway.